Wonderful. And we're joined by a bunch of other sites. So I think Mearns and Stonehaven and Aberdeen North and Cafe Church and who knows, somebody else as well I've maybe forgotten. So let's say hello to them all. Hi guys, hello. Do you remember what maps were? Do you remember maps, like big paper things? Once you unfolded them, you couldn't get them folded up again. Some of you are looking blankly, but lots of you know exactly what I mean. We used to most summers, we would drive from here to France and then down through France to just try and get as much ultraviolet light as we could. And we all know exactly why I needed to do that. And so, most summers it involved loads and loads of maps. One map to get us down to the south of England, and then another map for the northern part of France, and then another map for around Paris, and then another map sort of beyond there. And then one year I was speaking to my sister, and she was like, "Oh, we've got a sat-nav you can borrow." I was like, "What is this you speak of, a sat-nav?" And, I'm imagining in my mind like a dish that you have to strap to the roof of your car, and the back seat is full of boxes with beeping lights and all of that stuff. Well, anyway, she hands me this, you know what a sat-nav is. So she hands me this sat-nav, and so the night before we were driving all the way down to France, I'm programming the life out of this thing. Like, I'm figuring out what stops I'm going to fill up with petrol and where we're going to stay overnight. So I've just programmed every single possible place that we're going to be, and then we set off in the car. The kids are really excited. They're saying things like, "Are we nearly there yet, Dad?" And they're saying it ironically because they know exactly what time we're going to get there. It's going to be 8:37 or something like that. And then we get on the ferry the following day. We carry on driving through France. It's getting hotter and hotter and hotter. The sun is beating down on the car, on the windscreen, on the little black box that's attached to the windscreen. And it's like 37 degrees outside. And then the sat-nav dies. Like, in fact, it doesn't just die. It starts saying, "Recalculate," this lovely lady, recalculating. She can't stop saying it. You can't turn it off. You can't, none of the buttons work. Nothing works. We ended up having to stuff her in the boot, like bury her under stuff. She sounds like she's trying to escape, recalculate. It's like, "Let me out." And so anyway, Taryn says to me, my wife Taryn, the lovely Taryn, she says, "Oh, it's all right. We can just use the maps." Oh, yeah. The maps. Yeah, the maps that I didn't bring those. I didn't think we'd need those. And she's like, "What? Are you kidding me?" She says, "So let me get this right. We don't know where we're going and we don't know how to get there." I said, "Darling, it's much worse than that. We don't know where we are or how we got here either." Have you ever felt like that? Like, how on earth did I get here? Or, I wish I just knew where I was supposed to be. Or, I think I know where I'm supposed to be. I've just got no idea how I would get there. It's a common experience in life, isn't it? A few months ago, we shared about our sabbatical and our sense that actually that we're all supposed to be taking steps towards. Our church family, our destination for the next season is, I suppose, a greater communion with God. Like a place of intimacy with the Lord that we haven't been before, a sense of his presence, a sense of his power, a greater sense of our identity in Christ, like just a greater sense of the weight of the glory of God. And I don't know whether you feel it, but I just feel absolutely desperate for it. And in fact, over Christmas, I kind of chilled out a bit. And then as soon as I got back into it in the new year and we spent some time in the prayer room, I was like, goodness me, I feel more desperate than I've ever felt for just more of God. Like, do you know that there's more of God than we currently know? Just so desperate for it. And so the question then becomes, like, how do we get there? And please understand me, like, this is not just about having more exciting meetings on Sundays. This is absolutely not about that. This is about us being full up. Like, and then like the dial being cranked past 10 to like 11 or 12, and then us going out on Monday full up, overflowing with the presence and the power of God. Like that people would see in us something and they think, there's a longing in my heart for something that I think you have. That's what we're desperate for. And so the question is, how do we get there? Like, how do we find the road? Like, what is the journey that we need to take in order that we would, as a church family, get to a place where we could say, I think we're starting to taste some of what we long for. And so that's where we're going this morning in Exodus chapter 13. How would we recognize the road to glory? And just to explain, we're starting a new series today. It's called Glory, and it's just about this whole journey that the Israelites take. They're in captivity in Egypt, and this is the story that Taryn and I lived in during our sabbatical. We just seem to be in there most days. They're in captivity in Egypt, and God makes a promise to them in a sense. And the promise is of greater communion with himself. In fact, God says to Pharaoh, let my people go so that they can worship me in the desert. It's like, I'm going to meet with them. I'm going to be with them in the desert. And actually, at the end of the book of Exodus, Exodus chapter 40, you see that promise fulfilled. So they've gone from captivity to communion. And that's really the journey that we're wanting to go on as a church. So we're starting right at the point where Pharaoh lets the people go. And that's Exodus chapter 13, verse 17. It says this, when Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through the Philistine country, though that was shorter. For God said, if they face war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led the people around by the desert road toward the Red Sea. The Israelites went up out of Egypt ready for battle. Moses took the bones of Joseph with him because Joseph had made the Israelites swear an oath. He had said, God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up with you from this place. After leaving Succoth, they camped at Etham on the edge of the desert. By day, the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so that they could travel by day or by night. Neither the pillar of cloud by day nor the pillar of fire by night left its place in front of the people. Okay, so how do we recognize the right road? How do we recognize the road that leads to the glory of God? The first way is because it feels like it's the wrong road. It's the wrong road. I don't know whether there's some kind of genetic issue with my makeup, but I just find it very, very difficult to ask for directions. Can I get an amen? Like, some people seem to have that superpower when they're in a place, they suddenly don't know where they are or where they're going, and they can just like stop anyone and just ask them for directions. I don't have that superpower. Maybe it's like an admission of failure or an admission of defeat, and I'm worried that it might be the admission of defeat that breaks the camel's back, and so I just can't do it. And so I just find myself wandering around places. I was in Dunblane a while ago, just wandering around, and I was just longing that someone would just see that there was something badly wrong and just interrupt me and say, could I help you? Like, do you need help? That's what I really wanted. And so I find myself just wandering around places, just looking at people, hoping that they'll ask me whether they can give me directions. Well, that is not how the Israelites ended up taking this rather circuitous route to get to the promised land. It wasn't because some idiot at the front didn't want to ask for directions. They went God's way. It seemed to everyone else like it was the wrong road, but it was the road that led to the glory of God. Verse 17, when Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through Philistine country, though that was shorter. Verse 18, so God led the people around by the desert road towards the Red Sea. It seemed like to everyone else it was the wrong way, but it was God's way. And maybe if we want to experience more of God's presence and more of his power, maybe we just need to let go of our own map. Maybe we just need to acknowledge the fact that sometimes we think we know the way when we really don't know the way. I've been a student of revival for the last, 20 years. I just love stories of revival, moments where God just descends on a place and everyone in that place just can't avoid the presence and power of God. I love those stories. But do you know the thing that I've started to realize as I've read more and more of these books about revival is that there isn't really a single revival that's happened anywhere on the face of the earth that was led by someone with whom I agree. Do you know, like, their theology is almost always not my theology. And often God chooses to use people who I feel like saying to the Lord, Lord, could you not see that they were broken people before you started? But somehow God doesn't seem to see things the way that I see them. And it just seems to me that maybe as we go on this journey, I suppose what I'm trying to do is warn you that we'll see God filling people with his presence and his power, and we'll think, Lord, do you not know them? Or we'll see him like answering some prayers and not answering other prayers, and we'll be saying to the Lord, Lord, why are you doing it like that? Or we'll see him giving gifts to some people and not others, or some gifts to some people and other gifts to other people in a way that we think is completely nuts. But we just have to acknowledge the fact that God's road is not our road. I can think of a whole bunch of situations in the lives of people who I know and love where I feel like saying to the Lord, Lord, what are you doing? Why did you do that? And it just turns out that really we're just like teenagers. Like teenagers, they think they know everything, but they really don't. Maybe we're a lot more like that than we think we are. God's road is identifiable because it feels like it's the wrong road. Maybe maturity says, what if this road that feels like it's the wrong road is actually the right road? That's the first thing. The road to God's glory feels like it's the wrong road. The second characteristic of the glory road is it's the desert road. So the Israelites came out of Egypt. They were armed and ready for a fight. That's what it says. Verse 18, the Israelites went up out of Egypt ready for battle. I think what the writer is trying to tell us is they were full of bravado. Like they were full of self-confidence. They're like, we are ready for anything. We will take on anyone. Like just point us at the enemy and we'll go for it. And the Lord is really making a comment about their character. It says, verse 17, God didn't lead them on the road through the Philistine country, though that was shorter. For God said, if they face war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. He's saying, they think they're ready. They're really not ready. They think they've got what it takes. They really haven't got what it takes. They're full of self-confidence and self-assurance. That's a dangerous thing. I'm not going to put them into the line of fire until they're ready. And the Lord has an implement that he likes to use over and over again in the scriptures to deal with people's self-confidence and their self-assurance. And it's called the desert. Just think about Jacob. And now please understand, I know that there are people in our church today who've never read the Bible or, are not Christians or not familiar with the Bible. We don't assume anything, any knowledge, any prior experience, We're just really glad that you're here. But for those of you who know the story of Scripture a bit more, just think about people like Jacob. Jacob runs, having made an absolute mess of his life, and God meets him where? In the desert, in the wilderness. Moses tries to take matters into his own hands and kills the Egyptian soldier. And it's like he's full of self-confidence, and then he has to spend the next 40 years in the desert, where God is shaping him to become this remarkable leader who speaks to God like a man speaks with his friend. Or David. David spends the first part of his life tending sheep where? In the wilderness, whilst he's being prepared for royal authority. And then he's on the run from Saul and he's hiding in caves and just spending all of this time just hiding out in the wilderness where God is shaping him to be a man after God's own heart. The desert is an inhospitable place. It's not comfortable. The desert is an incredibly silent place. There are no background noises. There are no distractions to lessen the pain. The desert is a place where you have to come to terms with your own weakness and your own fragility. The desert is a lonely place. But above all, the desert is God's place. It's the place he takes us in order to heal us. And so we're led into the desert full of self-confidence and self-assurance. And we come out of the desert clinging on to God. That's actually what it says in Song of Songs, chapter 8, verse 5. It says, "Who is this coming up out of the desert, leaning on her beloved?" Leaning on her beloved. Our dear friend Mike Pilavachi, who founded the Soul Survivor Ministry, Soul Survivor Festivals, led them for 27 years, just got an MBE in the New Year's Honours List, which we're thrilled about. He wrote a book about the desert. It's called Wasteland. It's absolutely brilliant. It's kind of part memoir, part teaching. And in it, he talks about his childhood. He grew up with Greek Cypriot parents who didn't speak a word of English. And so he didn't speak a word of English until his first day at school. And you can imagine just having your first day at school and not understanding a single word that's said to you the entire day. And so he learned to spend the lunchtimes just walking around in circles in the playground. School became this incredibly painful place for him to be, a very lonely place. And I think for a period of time he was an elective mute. He just didn't speak for a couple of years. Amazing to think about that now, actually. Anyway, so he comes to know Jesus when he's 15. And quite soon after that, he knew that he would either be a missionary or a pastor or something like that. He knew, and so he was really surprised when he found himself studying at Birmingham University. He was like, "What am I doing here studying accountancy? Like, I'm not going to be an accountant." And so he's studying, he's thinking, any minute now the Lord's going to rescue me from this accountancy. But actually he graduates and eventually he went to Harvey Nichols, and he worked as an accountant in Harvey Nichols. And he was on a temporary contract. They kept saying to him, "Hey, listen, you don't get any sickness pay, you don't get any holiday pay, you don't get any pension contributions. You should accept this full-time permanent contract." He said, "I won't be needing that. This is not what I'm for. I'm going to be a missionary or a pastor or something like that." And so he just carried on like that, just expecting a rescue any moment now. 8 years later, he's still working as an accountant. He worked as an accountant till he was 29. He describes in the book his sense of abandonment, struggling with feelings of bitterness, seasons of real depression. But listen to how he talks about it now. He says, "The worst of times can also be the best of times. While I was going through those 8 wasted years, I would ask God regularly why he was taking so long to rescue me. Now my main question is, why did he not keep me there longer? In that time, my arrogance was dealt a mortal blow. My tendency to rely on my own resources and gifts were undermined, so that I began to inquire of the Lord in a way that I had never done before. In the desert, I saw my ambition for what it was and eventually came to the place where I was determined to seek God for myself, whether I had a ministry or not. More than anything else, I found that when I came to the end of myself, I came to the beginning of God." It's powerful, isn't it? Verse 18, "So God led the people around by the desert road towards the Red Sea." The glory road is the desert road. What if those of us who are in the desert right now are closer to the glory of God than the rest of us? What if God is doing something beautiful in your life that you haven't yet perceived? Honestly, I believe that that's a word for a whole bunch of people in our church. The desert road feels like abandonment, but actually it's a precious, tender gift. It's the kindness of God. The desert road is the glory road. Number 3, the road to glory is the faith road. It's a bit like, I don't know whether there's such a thing as a Christian pub quiz. There probably isn't. But if there was, then one of the questions would be, whatever happened to Joseph's bones? That would be a good question. And we know because we've just read this passage. And maybe, again, if you're not used to church, you're not usually around church, you're thinking, when they say Joseph, do they mean the same Joseph that I mean? You know, I close my eyes. That's the Joseph that we mean. That's exactly the one we're talking about. It's a kind of a riches to rags to riches to rags to riches story or something like that. And he's quite an amazing character. He finishes his life wearing the signet ring of the Pharaoh of Egypt, wearing the finest linen. He's in charge of the whole of Egypt. And so for anyone else, they'd be thinking, this guy has got it made. Like, he's made it. He's got everything anyone could ever want. But actually, that's not true. Because Joseph, at the end of Genesis, by faith, he says this, don't you dare bury me here. Because God has promised us a land. Bury me there. Do you see, it's an act of profound faith to say, I don't want to be buried without having received everything that's been promised to me. And 430 years later, they're taking his bones and they're carrying them up out of Egypt. And then they're about 40 years later on, they're digging a hole in the promised land and they're burying his bones in it. It's like, don't you dare bury my bones in Egypt. Verse 19, Moses took the bones of Joseph with him because Joseph had made the Israelites swear an oath. He said, God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones with you from this place. The point is, let's make sure that we don't settle for less than everything that God is offering to us. We must not settle. Do you know, to all onlookers, I don't know what people perceive, but you could easily say, well, you know, our church, Catalyst Vineyard, one of the larger churches around Scotland, you know, that's pretty good. You know, God seems to show up, people get saved. We see the occasional answer to prayer. That's pretty good. But by faith we say, we haven't seen anything yet. By faith we say, there has to be more than this. By faith we say, God, please give us more than this. Do not bury us here in Egypt, God. We have to be buried in the promised land. I read a biography a while ago of Steve Jobs, who is the founder of Apple. Lots of you will know that. And many of you will know that there were two Steves that were there at the start of Apple Computer. There was a guy called Steve Wozniak, who was like the techie guy, and Steve Jobs, and between them they started Apple. But what you maybe don't know is, at the very beginning of Apple Computer, there was a third guy. He was called Ronald Wayne. And he was also an initial shareholder in Apple Computers. In fact, the other guys put money in. I think Steve Jobs sold his camper van or something like that. Ronald Wayne didn't put any money in because he had written the original instruction manual for the Apple I computer. Is this thrilling? Anyway, I love this stuff. These three shareholders, and then a few days later, after they got going, Steve Jobs is like really getting excited. He's thinking about how they're going to generate more money, what the risks they're going to take and all of that. Ronald Wayne is like, this is going to go really badly for me. And so he sells his shares to the others. He had a 10% stake in Apple Computers. 11 days after Apple started, he sold his stake in the company for $800. And later on, he received a further $1,500. Had he stayed as a 10% shareholder in Apple Computer, he would now be the 15th richest person in the world. Let's not cash in our chips too early. Let's not settle for anything less than everything that God is promising us. Honestly, I believe that the next season of our church, if we will walk in faith and take steps in faith, I believe that we'll see more. The last thing is this, it's the obedience road. Verse 20, by day the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so they could travel by day or by night. You know, I've been reflecting on our journey as a church, and you know, there was a time when this one service was the only service and the only site that existed, and now there are I don't know, 11 or 12 services happening in 8 different locations. We've planted another 4 or 5 churches. It's all got a bit out of hand. But it's funny because we would never have chosen this journey by ourselves. You know, we tried to buy a warehouse. We tried to buy a casino. Like we were just looking for a bigger space for our one service to meet in. And then somebody gave me this bit of scrap of notebook paper with a picture drawn on it of a bunch of trees that were planted and then all kind of roped together. And it's like a canopy together with strength. And they were like, I think this is something to do with our church. I've still got the bit of paper. And then these other prophetic words started to come in from other people. And then somebody discovered the original founding document of our church that had this language of area churches and kind of gathering together occasionally, but then meeting in all these local communities the rest of the time. And I think in the end, there were like 27 individual prophetic words that came in over a period of a few months. And in the end, we were like, as leaders, Lord, I think we get the message. I think it's pretty clear what we're supposed to do. Would we have seen as many people come to know Jesus if we'd have bought the casino? Probably not. Would we have seen as many leaders released? Would we have seen the church grow as much as it has if we'd have bought the warehouse? Probably not. But that's how it works. God speaks, you follow. God speaks, you obey. God speaks, you do what he says. You see it happening with this pillar of cloud by day and this pillar of fire by night. It's like the Lord just leading his people in the way that he would have them go. Jesus puts it like this, John 10:27, my sheep listen to my voice. I know them and they follow me. The Apostle Paul said it like this, Romans 8:14, those who are led by the Spirit of God are the children of God. He leads, we follow. He calls, we obey. Why don't we stand? James, why don't you